So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on the Platonic dialogue, The Sophist. This is part 11, and likely going to be the last part of this series. I ended the last episode on a particular new road, a philosophical road that we were going down. We have roughly 4 pages left in this dialogue. We've come to this juncture through which we've come out of that prolonged discussion about being and non-being, that which is not. And we've returned to our original course. And I would say also a methodology by which we take something divided into two and follow the righteous path through it. And I'd like to catch us up to speed, and I'll say that I'm going to be taking a slight detour from the typical presentation. Usually there is a reading and then reflection on 2 pages, or the reading is on 2 pages and then there's a reflection on those 2 pages, and then it continues like that, in that progression. But we've come to a point where I like to spend a little bit of time developing some thoughts on a couple of paragraphs that are said by the visitor. So I'll read a little bit and then pick up from where we left off. So the visitor says, "Didn't we begin by dividing expertise into productive and acquisitive?" "Yes," says Theaetetus. "And under the acquisitive part the sophist appeared in hunting, combat, wholesaling, and types of that sort." "Of course. But now, since he's included among experts in imitation, first we obviously have to divide productive expertise in 2. We say imitation is a sort of production, but copies, and not of things themselves. Is this right?" "Absolutely." "First of all, production has 2 parts. "What are they?" "First of all, divine and human." "I don't understand yet," says Theaetetus. "If you remember how we started, we said that production was any capacity that causes things to come to be that previously were not." "I remember." "Take animals and everything mortal, including plants and everything on the earth that grows from seeds and roots, and also all lifeless bodies made up inside the earth, whether fusible or not. Are we going to say that anything besides the craftsmanship of a god makes them come to be after previously not being? Or shall we rely on the saying that the widespread belief that what? Are we going to say that the nature produces them by some spontaneous cause that generates them without any thought, or by a cause that works by reason and divine knowledge derived from a god?" Theaetetus responds, "I often shift back and forth on that from one view to the other, maybe because of my age. When I'm focusing on you now, and supposing that you think they come to be by the agency of a god, that's what I think too." So this is essentially what I want to contemplate here for a little while until we get to our next 2 pages. One of my central goals in doing this and going through the Old Testament, the way that I have so far at least, has been to develop a stronger, a closer relationship with the divine, with God, and to develop my definition of that thing, God. And when we are directly confronted with these types of questions, I think it's important to spend some time to think about it, to shed the superstition and to ground the mind, the believing mind, in that which is firm, steady, reliable, principled. So bringing the mind to focus on the statement, when the visitor says, "We said production was any capacity that causes things to come to be that previously were not." This is important. Up until now, we've been imagining our philosophical reality as something that has been influenced by basic principles, basic identities. In and of themselves, they don't have any real agency. They're more of the objective sort of philosophical dimensions, if we will. One of them is that which is, the other is that which is not. Quite simple. But the important thing to understand is their relation affords us with all that we see. It affords us with the possibility of independent thought, however frustrating and limiting it might be. It also affords us with the abundance of difference that we see on the earth and in the cosmos. For if everything was reduced to that which is, everything would be known, it would be constant, it would be one thing. And it would deny difference at all. It would deny the possibility of identification, because there is no difference. Nothing needs to be identified. And on the other hand, I should mention that I've been using to symbolize these principles or symbols in the form of metal chess pieces. The king is that which is, and the queen is that which is not. Now, the queen has an important function. She is not evil, she is not wicked. That which is not intended to imply absence, or in the Old Testament sense, that road towards wickedness and evil. The corruption of the human mind is something that is different from what we are talking about here. Her capacity gives life, gives identity to everything that is. And it is by her participation, her marriage to the king, that allows all of this difference to be. And also, by their difference, the things themselves participate with each other. And through their participation, they participate in being. And so there's a relational structure. So now we're going a layer deeper. We are now asking the question, well, what of that which is? What has brought it into being? We understand the productive capacity for that which is to be brought into being, to have new identities created by human intervention. But of course there are many things that precede or have their existence attributed to something that is not human. Now, it doesn't mean it's conscious, doesn't mean that it's an independent agent like the human being is, but it also does not mean it's not either. It's an open question. It's something that we have to think about. The visitor's question: are we going to say that anything besides the craftsmanship of a god makes them come to be after previously not being? Or shall we rely on the saying that nature produces them by some spontaneous cause that generates them without any thought, or by a cause that works by reason and divine knowledge derived from a god? So if we think about something that is, something that comes to be, we can ask the question, what is it dependent on? What is my being dependent on? Well, I think there are a few different answers to that. My participation, my willful participation, is an important part of that. But also the decisions of others that had, when I was not something that is, they had the inclination to give rise to something that would eventually become me. And it was not the case that for my existence that I all of a sudden came to be out of nothing. By some spontaneous cause. Now there are other things, perhaps, and we can pose the question, well, if it is the case that it happened to me, is it the case that all things must be this way, that they do not rely on spontaneous processes to come to be? Or is it possible that some things rely on that spontaneous process and others don't? So I suppose the first thing that we have to do is think about this word spontaneous. So if I'm going to define it, it generally means something that occurs naturally without external prompting or planning, often as a result of sudden impulse or inner feeling. Of course, this is quite an agentic-centered definition, but in a natural context, spontaneous can describe something arising from internal forces or causes, independent of external factors. For example, spontaneous combustion or spontaneous growth of plants. Now, it's quite easy to imagine how when we examine that which is and that which is not, and they're dovetailing together, how it's very difficult to find where inception has taken place. It is of my particular belief that we come from a creative engine. Exactly how that creative engine reverberates through all of this, I don't know. But I'm equally as exposed to the idea of somehow a spontaneous cause may arise. I don't even know what that means, though. So when we think about some internal process, some internal cause, I think the internalness of something both implies that which is and that which is not. Internal in the sense that it's identifying that which is, because if that which is not had something internal, maybe I should rephrase. We can say that that which is not is, but that which is not does not share in being the same way that that which is does. And internalness, while it may describe a particular way about non-being, it doesn't have the internal structure like that which is does, I suppose. And by this, I think internal implies something that is. Where non-being and difference comes into play is to give the surrounding context that there is an internal to this thing. Again, if everything just was as it is, then there would be no internal anything. It would all just be. But of course that's not the case. So already implicit in the definition of something that is spontaneous is an interaction between these two forces. But of course, the interaction among these two identities does not presuppose, or does not necessarily presuppose, a divine influence. So I'd like to leave this open, and for now just go through our 2 pages to read them and then come back and reflect. So the visitor responds to Theaetetus. He says, "Fine, Theaetetus. If we thought you were going to be the kind of person who might believe something different in the future, we'd try to use some cogent, persuasive argument to make you agree. But since I know what your nature is, and I know, too, that even without arguments from us, it will tend in the direction that it's pulled towards just now, I'll let the issue go. It would take too much time. I'll assume divine expertise produces the things that come about by so-called nature, and that human expertise produces things that humans compound those things into. According to this account, there are 2 kinds of production, human and divine." Right. Since there are 2 of them, cut each of them into 2 again. How? It's as if you already cut production all the way along its width, and now you'll cut it along its length. All right. That way there are 4 parts of it altogether, 2 human ones related to us and 2 divine ones related to the gods. Yes. Then if we take the division we made the first way, 1 part each of those parts is the production of originals. Just about the best thing to call the 2 parts that are left might be copy-making. That way, production is divided in 2 again. Tell me again how each of them is divided. We know that we human beings and other living things, and also fire, water, and things like that, which natural things come from, are each generated and produced by a god. Is that right? Theaetetus says yes. And there are copies of each of these things as opposed to the things themselves that also come about by divine workmanship? What kind of things? Things in dreams, and appearances that arise by themselves during the day. They are shadows when darkness appears in firelight, and they are reflections when a thing's own light and the light of something else comes together around bright, smooth surfaces and produce an appearance that looks the reverse of the way things look from straight ahead. Theaetetus says yes, those are 2 products of divine production, the things themselves and the copies corresponding to each one. The visitor says, and what about human expertise? We say house building makes a house itself and drawing makes a different one, like a human dream made for people who are awake. Of course. In just the same way, in other cases too, there are pairs of products of human production, that is, the thing itself, we say, and the copy. Theaetetus says, now I understand better, and I take it there are 2 kinds of double production, divine and human in each division. One kind produces things themselves, and the other kind produces things similar to them. The visitor says, let's recall that one part of copy-making is likeness-making. The other kind is going to be appearance-making, If falsity appeared to be truly falsity, and by nature one of those that are, yes, it was. But falsity did turn out that way. So are we going to count likeness-making and appearance-making as indisputably two forms? Yes. Then let's divide appearance-making in two again. How? Into one sort that's done with tools, and one that uses one's own self as the tool of the person making the appearance. What do you mean? When somebody uses his own body or voice to make something similar to your body or voice, I think the best thing to call this part of appearance making is imitating. Yes. Let's set this part off by calling it imitation, and let's be lazy and let the other part go. We'll leave it to someone else to bring it together into a unit and give it a suitable name. Alright, let's take the one and let the other go. The visitor says, but the right thing, Theaetetus, is still to take imitation to have two parts. Think about why. Tell me, he says. Some imitators know what they are imitating and some don't. And what division is more important than the one between ignorance and knowledge? None. Wasn't the imitation that we just mentioned the kind that's associated with knowledge? Someone who knew you and your character might imitate you, mightn't he? Of course. What about the character of justice and all of virtue taken together? Don't many people who are ignorant of it, but have some beliefs about it, try hard to cause what they believe it is to appear to be present in them? And don't they imitate it in their words and actions as much as they can? Theaetetus says, very many people do that. So that concludes those 2 pages. So let's get into this and try to understand exactly what's going on here. Okay, so keeping in mind that we are talking about the agency of a God that has caused this thing to be. Again, the visitor from the previous page, he says, are we going to say that nature produces them by some spontaneous cause that generates them without any thought, or by a cause that works by reason and divine knowledge derived from a God? And when he says them, he is referring to production. He is referring to, of the previous paragraph, animals, everything mortal, plants, everything on the earth that grows from the seed and roots, and also all lifeless bodies made up inside the earth, whether feasible or not. So production. Now, in my mind, I want to take this very seriously. What I'm trying to do within my own experience is to expand my understanding of what God might be, and develop a stronger relationship to that thing. There are plenty of ways in which a person can conceptualize or can relate to a concept as deep as God. I was just thinking when I was driving home today that the religious domain, from the principled sense, the rooted sense of the word, is something that permeates all of us, independent of our belief, whether we believe that all of this has come from nothing without any sort of divine or reasonable cause. The religious domain, in respect of the agent, is an unavoidable part of his nature. It is the very thing by which he understands other things to be connected. It is the process by which his mind processes information, and the way in which he structures that information to understand what is good is an extension. It is his moral, it is his ethical framework. But it's all within the religious context of binding, of purposeful binding. And again, to believe that something has come from nothing, or that something has come from divine inspiration or some logos, I think it would be inconsistent to think that what we are now as these agents that live life in terms of value and in terms of purpose, it would be a contradiction to continue life under a belief that if by our own accord or by some other means purpose is to be, that we should find ourselves in a situation of living without believing in it. So what I find interesting about our first paragraph here, spoken by the visitor, when he's speaking about Theaetetus, there are two potential meanings I think that are going on here. On one hand, there's almost an insult in the sense that the visitor might be implying that Theaetetus is just going along with what the visitor would like him to go along with. And part of that is sort of evidenced by what Theaetetus had to say. He says, I often shift back and forth on that from one view to the other, maybe because of my age. So there's that insecurity there. But also, there's the possibility that the visitor is pointing towards something of a certainty, that Theaetetus really actually believes in a particular direction, that he does believe that things are brought into being by some creative process independent of man's will, or some disinterested process, causeless process. He says, but since I know what your nature is, and I know, too, that even without arguments from us, it will tend in the direction that it's pulled toward now, I'll let the issue go. It would take too much time. But such an interesting bit of time I think it would be to flesh out both arenas. He says, I'll assume divine expertise produces the thing that comes about by so-called nature, and that human expertise produces the things that humans compound those things into. According to this account, there are two kinds of production, human and divine. So we have an important distinction here. The image that is brought forth is an interesting one, that nature is seen as this sort of playground, that the divine productive element uses nature, uses the laws of nature, uses the form of nature to produce what it will. And so the visitor says a bit about cutting the idea of production into two parts, and then cutting it again. And I think there's a significance here that might be missed. I think about this in the following sense. He mentions that we've cut it along its width to identify the production by man and the production by some divine source. So these are two potential roads now to go down. But he identifies now the possibility of cutting it down its length, as if there would be two different identities now, as opposed to the two that we had already established, the human and the divine. He said that way there are four parts of it altogether, two human ones related to us, and two divine ones related to the gods. Now there are plenty of ways I think one can approach this type of reasoning, but the vertical and the horizontal hold an interesting philosophical place. So in one sense we have what's called horizontal causality. This would be the cut across the width, also called temporal or linear causality. This is the cause and effect relationship that unfolds in time. moment by moment, is the kind of causality we typically think of in science or history. Examples would be a match lights a fire, one domino knocks over the next, your decision yesterday leads to consequences today. In terms of characteristics, there's the sequential characteristic, one thing happening after another, empirical, observable in the physical world, and contingent, depends on particular arrangements of matter, energy, or events. And then we have vertical causality, which is referred to or also called ontological or hierarchical causality. It refers to the continuous, sustaining cause of something being at every moment, not over time but right now. It is often described as the cause of existence, or the essence of things being real at all. So examples, the sun is to the solar system as the good is to the intelligible realm. A painting's being depends on the painter, not just in the past, but not in a higher order way of grounding its intelligibility and form. Our soul's existence might be said to depend on a higher cause that transcends time. So characteristics would be that it's simultaneous, the cause and effect coexist rather than unfold. Metaphysical deals with the ground of being itself. Hierarchical, the lower, contingent, depends on the higher, necessary or eternal. So of course, being a modern man, my difficulty lies with the vertical type of causality. Now, whether or not this is what he's referring to here, it's uncertain, but it's something that I want to keep in mind. The visitor says, if we take the division we made the first way, one part of each of those parts is the production of originals. Just about the best thing to call the two parts that are left might be copy-making. That way, production is divided into again. So I want to make sure that I'm following this, because this is a little confusing to me, his reasoning. So if we take the division that we made in the first way, that horizontal division that separated the human production from the divine production, he says one part of each of those parts is the production of originals. Just about the best thing to call the two parts that are left might be copy-making. So, if we take the divine and human, we split it in two. Now we have two categories that are seemingly separate, that were once this whole to observe. If we take a little piece out of the divine, let's say, it's easier to see in this way that this small piece is a production of the original. Now, production is an interesting word to use there, because it would seem that the whole must necessarily produce another piece for it to be a production, but I'll leave that as it is for a moment. Just about the best thing to call the two parts that are left might be copy-making. So that is right in a way, in the sense that we had our original, and we split them into two, and those twos are the two that are extant are not that original copy. Let's say if we had to draw this on a piece of paper like I'm doing now, it's obvious to see that the one whole is now split into two things that are easily identified as a copy. Now Theaetetus says, tell me again how each of them is divided. The visitor says, we know that we human beings and other living things, and also fire, water, and things like that, which natural things come from, are each generated and produced by a god. Is that right? Okay, so here is a strong assertion. So we are talking about the production of the divine that leads to the result that is all of material reality, all of life, and that it is the cause of the divine that does this. We are not going back to that point of trying to argue for some causeless existence. He says there are copies of each of those things, as opposed to the things themselves, that also come about by divine workmanship. So the copies are a curious thing. Something that seems so straightforward is all of a sudden quite difficult to examine. But there is at least the idea that there is some original, like an original man, for example, the form of man, the form of a leaf or of a tree. And there are copies of each of these things, as opposed to the things themselves. So this is essentially, I think, what I'm interpreting correctly. That again, if we take our chess piece analogy, that we have the forms of the things. This would be the thing in and of themselves. By themselves, they can be thought of, but they can't be by themselves. Of course, then they wouldn't participate in being. Now, what kind of things are these? Now, before we go into the visitor, I want to do a little bit of a thought experiment. Now, the thought experiment I want to run is a precursor to what the visitor has to say next, because there are some things about what he says that I don't quite understand. At least I don't understand the direction that he's going in. So he says, there are copies of each of these things. Of these things, I think about the forms. If I take, for example, the knight, our chess piece. Now this is the form, let's say, literally of the knight. That there is a man that has this relationship with the horse, and he has his feudal obligations. He must go to war when called upon by a particular noble class, etc. The copies of this knight would offer a distinction. They would be copies from the original form. These copies, as we see them, give us difference. It is not as though we see one knight and he is exactly the same as another. But with regard to sameness, we can identify the knight because there is a form of knightness that describes him. And as soon as that thing falls outside of the form of knightness, then he is no longer a knight. And I think there's a lot of blurred territory through which argumentation can be established. But approaching closer and closer that periphery, it'll be harder and harder to maintain a relationship to the form of the knight when so many characteristics are denied of that form. Now Theaetetus, he says, what kinds of things? The visitor says things in dreams and appearances that arise by themselves during the day. They are shadows when darkness appears in firelight. and they are reflections. When a thing's own light and the light of something else comes together around bright, smooth surfaces and produces an appearance that looks the reverse of the way the thing looks from straight ahead. Now here we're getting more into that sophist type territory, at least it would seem to me, because we have sort of a copy but also a reflection, sort of a reversal. And he's not really going in the direction that I would think that he would go in, which is that of this relatedness to some original form, the original form being the production of the God. But keeping in mind that we are trying to find the sophist, I suppose we do have to stay on track a little bit. So let's take our illustration of the night. So we start at level 1, which is the form of the night. This is something that is created by our God. This is the intelligible form. It is pure. It is foundational. It is most real ontologically. Once we reach our second level, we have what might be called the actual night. Its type of being is the material copy of the form. It participates in the form, but it is less real than the pure ontological form of the night. The third level might be a painting of a night. This is an artistic imitation. It imitates appearance, not essence. But it is still less real than the level 2, the actual night, which is less real than the form of the night. Then we go to a fourth level. Now we keep on moving into the periphery, which is the shadow or the reflection. This is the optical phenomena. This is where we get into what the visitor is talking about, things in dreams, shadows when darkness appears in firelight. They are reflections when a thing's own light and the light of something else comes together around bright, smooth surfaces and produce an appearance that looks like the reverse of the way that the thing looks from straight ahead. So in this way, there is a deceptive appearance. Its participation in being is illusory. Then we get to the fifth layer, or the fifth level. This is where we have the sophist's speech, where we have a verbal image. It creates a false appearance of knowledge, some dangerous illusion, for which we cannot trace back to level 1, the pure foundational form. Now Theaetetus says, yes, those are two products of divine production, the things themselves and the copies corresponding to each one. Interestingly, he doesn't say anything about the visitor's expansion into the periphery, away from the copy making that is completed by the divine. But I think at the very least we can appreciate how this copy making is, it can be something seen as a good. Because all things that are to be, if they are to come from a form, they have to participate in this copy making somehow, in this framework of understanding. It is not until we lose sight of the form or are deceived by someone who wishes to bring us closer to some form, but in fact does the opposite or gives us an illusion, some image that is completely incompatible to the actual form of the thing, that we find falsehood and more than just that, deception. The visitor says, what about human expertise? We say house building makes a house itself, and drawing makes a different one, like a human dream made for people who are awake. So within the category, or within mind of what we've already gone through with regard to the production of the divine, we now turn our eyes towards the human expertise, the human production. So the first thing he says is that we say house building makes a house itself. Now, necessarily, the human being is a step down from God. The human being is a copy of a form, we can say. And so we are thinking about a copy producing something. But the copy also participates in this form building, let's say. The house, in the mind of man, is his own form. And so he copies it, and he makes the house itself. This is what we might call the real house or the material house. A step away from the form that was in his mind. And then again we go down to level 3, which is the drawing of the house. And then we can say, go down to level 4, which would be the human dream. The visitor continues and he says, in just the same way, in other cases too, there are parts of products of human production. That is, the thing itself, we say, and the copy. Theaetetus says, now I understand better, and I take it that there are two kinds of double production, divine and human, in each division. One kind produces things themselves, and the other kind produces things similar to them. Now this double production is key, because in my extrapolation I've gone past the double production, but we can still label it as a double production. Once we get to the productive or the agent that has the creative capacity, let's say the divine or the human, we then say the next step down, so to speak, is the establishment of the form. The human being and the divine have the capacity to do it. So this would be Theaetetus' first reflection. That there are two kinds of production, but he says one kind produces things themselves. So this would be the form, the thing itself, or the knight that is symbolized by the metal chess piece. The other kind would be the thing that is similar to it, but it's on the periphery. But here I think it's important to have the distinction, because what's on the periphery can be in likeness to the form, or it can be in appearance to it. It depends on the degree of separation. So the immediate step down of the form is the material knight. It is the thing that actually participates in being with the knight. A step down from that would be something, again, like the painting, or like some pretender that puts on knight's clothing, but actually has no formal connections to knighthood. They have not gone through a ceremony. They don't know how to conduct themselves in war. Maybe they don't have a good relationship with the horse that they ride. There are plenty of things that we can identify, multiple factors. And eventually, we get into the realm, rather than of likeness, to that of appearance. And where exactly that crossover point is, I think, is difficult. But it can be easy to understand why it might be difficult to find the Sophist if he is constantly being this sort of phantom-esque figure that goes in and out of this distinction. Now, the next part is where the visitor brings this up. He says, let's recall that one part of copy-making is likeness-making. The other kind was going to be appearance-making. If falsity appeared to be truly falsity, and by nature one of those that are. but falsity did turn out that way. So are we going to count likeness-making and appearance-making as indisputably two forms? Theaetetus responds, yes. Then let's divide appearance-making into one sort that's done with tools, and one that's done with one's own self as the tool of the person making the appearance. When somebody uses his own body or voice to make something similar to your body or voice, I think the best thing to call this part of appearance-making is imitating. So it's a bit of an interconnected web, a bit confusing, but let's think about this for a moment. So going back to what the visitor had to say about copy making. So we've already established this. He said, let's recall that one part of copy making is likeness making. So certainly we understand that. Let's take the divine, for example. The copy making of the divine is the form of the night. That is the likeness making. The other kind is the appearance making. This is approaching the deceptive. It doesn't necessarily have to be deceptive, but I think it can fall into it because, again, the appearance is moving away from the step down from the form, is moving away from the step down of the step down. And again, it's not really too difficult to see at a certain point, because if we draw the circle around the form and we draw an arrow away from it and then a series of concentric circles that are around that circle, eventually we'll see that broad identity that emerges, that is so far away from it, is going to not even resemble anything close to it. So a bad painter, for example, might paint a knight and nobody will have any understanding of what it is. Think about a child that produces a finger paint of a knight, and the parent says, oh, that's very nice. What is it? Maybe the child gets upset, who knows. But the point being is that the child's representation of the knight is so far removed that the parent is unable to identify it, even in the appearance of the knight. So of appearance making, we may have an intentional or an unintentional appearance. An unintentional might be a natural illusion, a shadow or reflection. Or it might be intentional, an imitative illusion, like a painting, or like the Sophist. I'm interested in what he has to say here about falsity. It seems like he's identifying falsity in the sense of that which is, like it is the created form of falsity, and he's talking about it being something that is. And so because of its nature, because of its participation, what we would expect to see is a movement away from something that is. Because again, we are these imperfect beings. We are unable to see everything clearly. And even in our participation in the forms, I think we are limited, despite being agents that can establish forms themselves. Kind of interesting to think about it, but again, a bit confusing. He says, let's set this part off by calling it imitation, and let's be lazy and let the other part go. We'll leave it to someone else to bring it together into a unit and give it a suitable name. So today happens to be a new day, and a new day brings new thoughts. So I will slowly catch up to where I was. But there's a thought that had come to me in thinking about this appearance making versus likeness making, born of what we call copy making. Along the similar line to what I was saying the other day about as we move away from the periphery of or as we move away from the center being the form, and we move into the periphery, we're moving away from likeness and more into appearance. At least it would seem. And while I find it acceptable that we have split the copy making into appearance making and likeness making, it's useful for us to see in this way how we may be deceived by something if something is a mere appearance versus something that is in likeness to it. There's more of a certainty in likeness and a greater liberality or uncertainty when it comes to appearance. Now this is a good faith expression of appearance making, of course. It can be entirely malicious or deceptive, as we are trying to discover with the Sophist. But nonetheless, I say this because I wish to solidify that idea that as we move away from the center, although we may break copy making into likeness and appearance making, I do want to say that as we move from copy making into likeness making, we can still have appearance making. But when we move from copy making straight to appearance making, I have to wonder a couple things. The first copy that I mentioned is a step down from the form, from the purest spiritual sense of the thing. Now, if we go to appearance instead of likeness, I suppose there are a number of ways that we might wish to do so. An artist might do so so that they can take particular liberties with what they see. Now, the artist would have to see the form, or would have to reflect on the form in a sort of a philosophical manner in order to generate this appearance. So the Sophist would be a perfect candidate for this. But just speaking about the artist for a moment, what comes to mind is thinking about a movie that is, or a movie that is based on a novel, let's say. Now the novel is what we would consider made in likeness to some form of some narrative that has been thought of. It has been brought down to us so that we can enjoy it. But it's hard to say if that thing is actually the formal version of that narrative, that is the fullest that it could be. Maybe this is not a good way to think about it. But I do think that there's some logical sense to it. The movie that is based on the book, based on the narrative, is something that is loosely based on it. There are liberties that are taken. There are things that are in the book that surely will not make it into the movie. And by this, there is a step away. Now I have to go back and again reflect on that possibility for which the artist has some form or some ideal in mind, but then creates an appearance of that form that is a bit of a bastardization, that has nothing to do with their original thought. Unfortunate for the creator, perhaps, but unknown to all those who may consume the product or the end result. Now, I suppose I'm taking a step back for the following reason. I should apologize that I had not fully explored the expression, if falsity appeared to be truly falsity, and by nature one of those that are. I think I can move past this. But my desire to understand when the visitor says, but falsity did turn out that way, to be that which is. So, are we going to count likeness-making and appearance-making as indisputably two forms? Now, just a moment ago, I floated the idea that it's possible to make likeness-making, or appearance-making rather, a step away from likeness-making, a step down from it, so it doesn't have its own form in and of itself. And then I spoke of it in the contrary way, in the sense that appearance-making and likeness-making, as it comes from that center point of copy-making, now they have their own distinct identities. So I want to describe for a moment why falsity is something that is. Of falsehood, we can say that it is a misrepresentation of the participation of non-being in being. It's a misunderstanding of proper relation among things. And because there is this poor relation, falsity exists. Or rather, I should say, falsity is something that is possible. Now we say it is something that is because it has an identity. It has the potential for relation outside of its form. And because it can participate in being, it can participate in thingness, and it is something. So regardless if we are talking about likeness making, which is a form of copying that tries to be as close as possible to good relation, or to good original intent, let's say, to the form of the matter. Or we look into appearance making, which is a clouded sort of representation of some form. And that cloud often leads to various antagonisms. Antagonisms for which particular minds may find it useful for deception, or find it useful to fall into, and to participate farther in falsity. And so we are going to circle appearance making, and we divide it into two. One sort that's done with tools, and one that uses one's own self as the tool. The tool of the person making the appearance. So an interesting way to orient oneself. Now here I think we can certainly see how the sophist would position himself in a way to use to convince somebody that he is the tool to be used to produce something that is deceptive. That's how he makes his living. When somebody uses his own body or voice to make something similar to your body or voice, I think the best thing to call this part of appearance making is imitation. Now there's a bit of a discrepancy here in my mind. What is said when the visitor says, when somebody uses his own body or voice to make something similar to your body or voice, I don't think it's a necessary direct relation to what was said prior, where he divides the types of appearance making, one sort that is done with tools, and one that uses one's own self as the tool of the person making the appearance. Now, to use oneself as the tool is not necessarily to make somebody's own body or voice, or make his own body or voice into something similar to another body or voice. But it is a possible outcome, I suppose. Now, this open playground is something a bit strange to me. In the sense that I understand where we are going. In imitation, I think there is much potential. There's potential for which we can narrow down the Sophist. We could surely understand how he might be related to imitation. If one is to use one's own body to mimic somebody else's, it is possible to, I suppose, have a number of different things occur. One is gaining the perspective of that person. Another, as the visitor has said, is to imitate or to reflect what they are saying. I suppose that's a degree of relation to what I just mentioned. The visitor says, let's set this part off by calling it imitation, and let's be lazy and let the other part go. The other part is the one that is done with tools. But still, what we have to figure out is exactly this jump that the visitor took between one that uses his own self as the tool of the person making the appearance, and somebody using his own body or voice to make something similar to your body or voice. Now, to narrow this down a little bit farther, and to clear some confusion perhaps that I'm causing for myself, I understand that, in the first instance at least, a tool can be anything that would generate something appearance-related. Anything that is a step down from the actual, or from the being that participates most directly in the form, without being that thing itself. So, for example, I, the human being, participate in the form of the human being, but I am not the form of the human being. In the same way as a sculpture of me can participate in the human being that I am, maybe the form of me, let's say, but still not be me, be the form itself. It is a step down. The resolution fuzzier, less certain. And so in terms of the arts, this is quite useful to have tools that allow us, whether they be skills or physical tools like a hammer and a chisel, to chip away at the marble to make the statue or the sculpture. On the other hand, the human being is the tool. I mentioned that there are a few different sides to this. There is a good side, I think, in the sense that we can also introduce the arts into this experience again, and say maybe the tool, being the person himself or herself, is used by a director to make a narrative. And so the actor in this situation is not necessarily deceptive, but they are playing a part for a broader purpose, to make the appearance of something become actual. And there are all sorts of useful purposes for this. I mean, there are, of course, poor purposes, antagonistic purposes, wicked purposes, but so we see the whole of this. And then we see the potential for which an individual that would wish to deceive may use themselves as the tool, but as the artist draws back on the hammer and moves it towards that chisel to hit the marble block, instead now we have this intermediary being, the human being, the sophist perhaps, that uses the force of the blow to direct where he wishes to carve the marble. And on a young, impressionable mind, this is something that can have a profound effect. He says, I think the best thing to call this part of appearance making is imitating. I want to reiterate something here. I think about money being the medium of exchange through which value flows. The value is something that money itself doesn't produce. People say that governments produce it, but they're producing the environment, I think, necessary for the value to exchange. The value is in the mind. The tool through which the appearance or the step down being something that is farther away from, we could say farther away from the truth, I suppose, but that language can get lost, I think, quite easily. The step down is just, again, it's a shadow, something away from the actual. But there are plenty of things in mind that are a step down or a step away from the actual that still serve a functional purpose. This functional purpose may be transitory. That is a place maybe we don't want to be forever until we find a new and better method by which we can exchange value, in the sense of money or in the sense of appearance making, maybe in the arts or wherever else we might find it, some representation. For whatever reason, I think about GDP here, the economic determinants or economic objectives by which we might measure something. All of these are methods of appearance making. And I know that I've said this just a moment ago, but again, not all of them are deceptive. And I think that that's important because the sophist is not going to rest in the place that's not deceptive. Eventually he's going to find himself in that relation that is towards falsehood. Towards... now we know that he lives here already because the environment is such that it is cloudy. He can make his false claims under that shroud and get away free from it, essentially. It is not until we trace him here and we move away the clouds and we say, okay, out of everything, much like Theaetetus has said before, he can run from one place to another, hide in any number of different distinctions of appearance, and commit his crime of falsehood to the minds of the populace. The self as an instrument is not inherently sophistical, but perilous. It requires a virtue to bear the weight of appearance, and not to fall into falsehood. So the sophist is slippery because he doesn't merely tell lies. He embodies a false likeness. He is a distortion because the medium, or he himself, is shaped for a manipulative effect. And the manipulative effect may rest within this imitation, but it's not the immediate step, I think, to go to when we're reflecting on appearance making, that we go to imitation. Especially if we come off of using one's own body as a tool for somebody else's appearance making. He says, but the right thing, Theaetetus, is still to take imitation to have two parts. Some imitators know what they are imitating and some don't. And what division is more important than the one between ignorance and knowledge? So quite an important statement. But I want to focus on the first part of that. Some imitators know what they are imitating and some don't. The illustration of the fog, I think, is going to become increasingly important. Or the phantasm, the reflection in the water, any number of step-down appearances that we can use as descriptors to describe exactly what is happening here. And again, the important part is that we're focusing on the potential for distortion, the potential for misunderstanding. So let's define imitation. So from the Latin we have the Latin word imitatio, meaning to copy or to imitate, the act of copying or mimicking. The root verb imitare itself is thought to be connected to a very old Indo-European root, possibly aim, meaning to copy or to portray. However, it is not certain. Latin imitare is somewhat of an isolated formation and doesn't have many clear cognates in other Indo-European languages. Imitare is a deponent verb in Latin, passive in form but active in meaning, perhaps symbolizing the peculiar duality of imitation itself. It appears like the original, passive resemblance, but is also an active performance of copying. So I suppose this is already something that we have known. This is something that we've established on our build-up to separating appearance making into the two forms that we have separated it into. So some imitators know what they are imitating, and some do not. You know, when I think about my own experience with understanding, especially in a professional context, moving from somebody that is more junior to somebody that is a little bit more established, there is this process of, sometimes it's referred to as imposter syndrome. I think at the core of that, there is this relationship, unfortunate relationship between likeness making and appearance making. But especially early on in terms of appearance making, because we are that early artist that says, or that wishes to produce something, to make something, to instruct on something that their knowledge is imperfect on. And there's a lot of mistakes early on in any skillful pursuit, discipline, whatever. And so there is this sort of imitation. We copy what we have seen. We've copied what works. Maybe we don't understand why it works. Maybe we've seen something that is done by convention, but it's actually something that is false. And so in such a way we participate in an appearance of knowing something, but we are participating in appearance of something that is not true. Already a false relation among that which is and that which is not. Now, some imitators know what they are imitating. Perhaps they are trying to sell something, and they know that the thing that they are trying to sell is different than the way or the method or the way in which they describe the product that they are selling. What division is more important than the one between ignorance and knowledge? One not knowing and one knowing, one misunderstanding or having poor sight to even see the relationship between that which is and that which is not, and the other to see it more clearly. Wasn't the imitation that we just mentioned the kind that's associated with knowledge? Someone who knew you and your character might imitate you, mightn't he? Of course. What about the character of justice and all of virtue taken together? Don't many people who are ignorant of it, but have some beliefs about it, try hard to cause what they believe it is to appear to be present in them? And don't they imitate in their words and actions as much as they can? So I suppose there's not much to say here, other than that potential that we talked about before, the responsibility that occurs from the potential for falsehood in appearance making, the responsibility of goodness, of if we are going to design something by appearance because of our own ignorance, we do so in the effort of guiding somebody towards, or ourselves towards, something that is more of likeness, something that is more towards the form of the thing, rather than away from it. Now, ignorance has an interesting way of being lost in the woods, being on the periphery from where the form actually is. Perhaps we circle around it in this sort of unfortunate desert-like manner, starving and suffocating and being dehydrated, absent of all the primary essentials for true understanding. Or maybe we even move away from it, anything but move towards it, in that state of ignorance. I suppose there's a possibility in one sense, but in terms of virtue and things that are so large, it would necessarily be only a fraction of it that we would get right if we did attempt to get it right, if we are steeped in such profound ignorance. So that concludes the 2 pages. What I'd like to do now is read the remainder of this dialogue, and then do a final reflection on what is offered. So we have about a page and a quarter left. Starting with the visitor, he says, "And are they all unsuccessful at seeming to be just without being just at all? Or is the opposite true?" Theaetetus says, yes, the opposite. "I think we have to say that this person, who doesn't know, is a very different imitator from the previous one who does." "Yes," says Theaetetus. "Where would you get a suitable name for each of them? Isn't it obviously hard, too, just because the people who came before us were thoughtless and lazy about dividing kinds into types, and so they never even tried to divide them. That's why we necessarily lack a good supply of names. Still, even though it sounds daring to distinguish them by calling imitation accompanied by belief mimicry, and imitation accompanied by knowledge informed mimicry, all right, then we need to use the former term, since the sophist isn't one of the people who know, but is one of the people who imitate." He certainly is. Let's examine the belief mimic, the way people examine iron, to see whether it's sound or has a crack in it. All right. Well, it has a big one. One sort of belief mimic is foolish and thinks he knows the things he only has beliefs about. The other sort has been around a lot of discussions, and so by temperament he's suspicious and fearful that he doesn't know the things that he pretends in front of others to know. There definitely are both types that you've mentioned. Shall we take one of these to be a sort of sincere imitator and the other to be an insincere one? That seems right. And are there one or two kinds of insincere ones? You look and see, says Theaetetus. The visitor says, I'm looking, and there clearly appear to be two. I see that one can maintain his insincerity in long speeches to a crowd, and the other uses short speeches in private conversation to force the person talking with him to contradict himself. You're absolutely right. How shall we show up the long-winded sort? As a statesman or as a demagogue? A demagogue, says Theaetetus. And what shall we call the other one? Wise or a sophist? We can't call him wise, since we took him not to know anything. But since he imitates the wise man, he'll obviously have a name derived from the wise man's name. And now at last I see what we have to call him, the person who is really and truly a sophist. Shall we weave his name together from start to finish and tie it up the way we did before? Of course, says Theaetetus. The visitor says, imitation of the contrary speech-producing, insincere and unknowing sort of the appearance-making kind of copy-making, the word-juggling part of production that's marked off as human and not divine. Anyone who says the sophist is of this blood and family will be saying, it seems, the complete truth. Theaetetus says, absolutely. And so this marks the end of the dialogue, the Sophist, to be continued in the Statesman, which is the next dialogue. But as our closing responsibility, let's go through this and see what we can come up with. So let's go back to the paragraph on the previous page that is stated by the visitor. He says, what about the character of justice and all of virtue taken together? I'm going to pause there for a moment. Let's take this character. Just a moment before, he says, wasn't the imitation that we just mentioned the kind that's associated with knowledge? Someone who knew you and your character might imitate you. Again, the use of the word character. And I'd also like to draw the mind's attention towards the human being and the human being's capacity for production. And given that there is this capacity, that we are able to imagine forms, let's say, and copy as we see fit to bring that heavenly material down to earth and to bring it up. Such a great capacity is accompanied by a faculty that, while it may be used for such a purpose as elevating base material with the heavenly, the spiritual, it can also observe. It can observe the character, perhaps the form of an individual, let's say. It can be involved in reproduction as opposed to just capacity and production. Now, this reproduction we can split into a few different parts, of course, but of the type that we're speaking about the imitator's reproduction. What he reproduces is an appearance or a step down, necessarily, of that form that he observes in another, or the character, I should say, that he observes in another. It's easy, I think, for me to get the words mixed up here, so I want to be a bit careful. When I say form, this is a pure concept imagining of what the actual is. is based on. It is a copy of likeness. The actual is the copy of likeness. But the form is the thing that it is copied from. The form, whether it be in the divine mind or the human mind, when we decide to create something, it doesn't matter. But the form then has the actual that is created from it. Like, for example, an idea of building a home. I don't want to reduce a form to the pure idealistic, but in a sense, this is a fundamental component of it, that it is created there, that its essence, the spirit, has been founded somewhere foundational. Now, on the other hand, if we talk about the human being as a step down from the form that is created by the divine mind, we say that this is a copy of likeness. And as a character, as an individual, observes this likeness, at best he can produce a step down from that. If he takes on what he observes as his own nature, as his own character, he becomes an appearance. He becomes a statue or a painting. Now we are being asked to imagine how this is the case when we speak about something like justice, almost like a person, let's say. But a person certainly, within their character, can embody a certain belief about justice. They exhibit it in their behavior, in their speech, in their ideas. But what is important here, I think, is to reflect on the sense in which this character that is developed is imperfect, that it is subject to falsehood, to misseeing, that the proper relationship between that which is and that which is not may be off. And given the various complexities and contextual relevances that are necessary to understand virtue, goodness, and all that sort of thing, falsity and mistake is eventual. It's going to happen. Again, what about the character of justice and all of virtue taken together? Don't many people who are ignorant of it, but have some beliefs about it, try hard to cause what they believe it is to appear to be present in them? Now here we see the word again, appear. That while man has the capacity to see, what he is seeing is something that is partial. And it's not necessarily to say that because he sees something partial that he cannot be good or that he cannot understand what is just, but it just means that it is fuzzy. It is not as easy as relying so inherently, let's say, like on the body's physical function. We are so adapted to the environment that we have come from, and the laws of nature that we have always participated with, that when we come out of the womb adapted creatures. That level of intuition is quite deep. But the structures of justice and virtue seem to be, perhaps from a perceptual sense, newer on that time scale. Or maybe we just are not all that good at seeing it. The same case could be made, in a sense, about our physical prowess. But also the opposite case could be made about justice and virtue. That we have the capacity to see it, and we do participate in it. We have produced our societies. we necessarily force ourselves to conduct some sort of structural relation that breeds the necessity for justice and ideas of virtue. And in this way, as we come out of the womb somewhat adapted to nature, of course we have to train for it. If a child is left in his crib, he will not develop physically. And much like a human being that is left without understanding and interaction among the civil organization, he may find himself in a state that is less than, a state that is stunted, much like that physical analogy. But all the same, we are asked here to reflect on those who are ignorant of it, as I myself am. And I surely have beliefs about these things, and the harder I push, it would seem at times when I'm most thankful, I push into a space that is forgiving enough, where I'm not tying myself down, so to speak, from a virtuistic or moral standpoint. That there's enough slack that is given to recognize contextual relevance and have the virtues of patience and honesty come into play. But there are certainly moments for which the opposite occurs, that I do not have the patience. I'm overly selfish. I say the wrong thing. I let aspects of my self-indulgent personality invade other aspects that I'm completely unaware of, and it could be seen by another as unseemly and of poor moral quality, let's say. He says, and don't they imitate it in their words and actions as much as they can? Of course they do. Of course I do. What else would I do? We have to have some idea of justice, virtue. We are always beings that pass judgment, both good and bad. Judgment is a pervasive thing. The mind makes judgments all day, in relation to people, but also in relation to things, objects, material things, organizational things, hierarchical things. There are many things that we relate to and that we have opinions about, and we have ideas about goodness and badness, let's say, truth and falsity. But here I want to point out that we are focusing on the Sophist and the remainder of this. So while my mind constantly wants to be drawn towards the recognition and understanding that despite being these limited creatures, for which our ideas, our beliefs in justice and virtue may be but an appearance, it is still something that will point us in the direction of something that is true and actual. It is also by this very nature that we are limited, that we can fall into deception, that we ourselves can practice something completely against what another part of our mind may believe. But because we cannot necessarily see the entirety of the picture, we don't understand the proper connections among things. And the visitor says of these imitators, are they all successful at seeming to be just without being just at all? Or is the opposite true? Now here is the the important statement. Are they all unsuccessful at seeming to be just, without being at all? This idea of being, of taking on the character of justice, which means seeing justice in a particular way. It implies knowing. And so there's this relationship between the seeing and knowing aspect of mind and being. That allows us to take on aspects of another being and copy it, demonstrate it, unveil it in a way that it becomes a part of us. And the visitor makes the distinction of the person who does not know, that he's trying to be just, but actually is not just at all, and then the person that does. The person that does is the type of the sophist. The visitor asks, where would you get a suitable name for each of them? Isn't it obviously hard to, just because the people who came before us were thoughtless and lazy about dividing kinds into types, and so they never even tried to divide them. That's why we necessarily lack a good supply of names. Still, even though it sounds daring, let's distinguish them by calling imitation accompanied by belief mimicry, and imitation accompanied by knowledge, informed mimicry. So again, we are trying to distinguish these types. Imitation accompanied by belief mimicry, and imitation accompanied by knowledge, informed mimicry. Now here, there's a subtlety between belief and knowledge. In the proper instance, in the proper relation, they are well related. They are well oriented to one another. Now I want to bring back into the forefront of mind the concept of imitation. And when we are thinking about imitation, it's fairly neutral until it is not. In the basic definition here, imitation is referring to copying. I think we can discuss exactly what it means to truly embody something versus to copy something and take it on for our own. As mentioned before, this type of observation and integration is a step down. It is clouded. It is in a fog. It is but an appearance. Appearances have value. Appearances have possibility for deception. The thing about copy making and integration at that level, it is very rare, I think, that a human mind would do such a thing. It is usually always augmented, supported, or perhaps even diminished by prior memories, prior experiences, prior characters that we come into contact with. Taking on an entire set of virtues that is of a particular context in which a mind had thought them through is, it would be impressive if one was to do that, but I would have to question the sincerity of such a thing, that one does not have the capacity or denies themselves the capacity of actually integrating a moral compass into their... Now, I'm I'm taking some liberties here because I like to use the virtue that we were talking about earlier, moral compass, whatever it happens to be. But again, that these people would lack the first-hand experience of building in a practical manner, the way of their being. And again, it's not to say that ideas that have been written by others in particular periods are useless to us. They can inform an entire experience, a pilgrimage of mind for which we come to understand things that are true, make us better people, make us better to ourselves and to each other. Now, the visitor makes a distinction between knowing and imitating, which I believe is what we've just outlined. That there's the difference, again, between the copy-making, not just of likeness and appearance, but the copy-making that only goes so far in mind and in ontology. Ontological expression is unique. It is something that is multifaceted. It is something that can be reduced to fundamental elements, but it is not something that can be easily transferred onto somebody else. Difference, we have to remember, outlines all things. It gives it identity. And if we were to become in likeness to something else, we would assume its identity. But it is not possible to do so. It would be, as is suggested, a mimic, a copy only. So this concept of true integration, true transformation, is limited in that sense. There's a barrier to it. Transformation itself is not impossible, of course. We can be transformed by difference in ontological expression, but we ourselves would embody that in a particular manner. Then it may appear similar, but it will be different. So we move on to examining the belief mimic. And he uses a material example to begin the explanation. He uses iron. And the illustration of whether it be a sound thing, the test for which is if it is exposed perhaps to some force or some elements over time, does it crack? And the visitor says of the belief mimic that there's a big crack in that expression. He is foolish and thinks he knows the things he only has beliefs about. So let's pause there. Belief. A term that we had described earlier. A term that I'm beginning to associate as appearance, because the definition of which becomes fuzzier and fuzzier. But perhaps that is because that is what the word is. Now, just like with many things that I've already mentioned, there's a good side of things and there's a bad side of things. There's a potential deceptive side to this belief. But it would be a sin, I think, to say that belief itself is a negative thing, or that it's something that ought to be done away with, perhaps. There's a subtlety in which many mechanisms of mind can be used. Bringing back the earlier discussion about speech. Speech unites names, or the nouns, and verbs, actions, to say something about something. Belief internally assembles ideas in the soul. So it certainly is not nothing. And it can be just as based on truth if knowledge can. Knowing something is a complicated matter. The fact of something must, I think, necessarily involve a belief. But a fact, we could say that a fact is false, but there's a bit of a oxymoronic statement there. But we can have a false belief in the sense that we can go beyond that observational realm into the formal domain and try to produce. But in our desire to produce, we come into contact with the realities of the laws by which we are governed, and we may not be able to do so. So remembering Theaetetus sits as one of our example statements given by the visitor, a true belief, if Theaetetus was sitting. Theaetetus flies, a false belief, since he cannot fly. In both cases, belief is a kind of internal speech or judgment, an act of the soul that attempts to grasp what is. And again, since we are these imperfect beings, and belief engages in that which is not, but also that which is, we can make the mistake of saying what is for what is not. So today is a new day. Forgive me for the pause. But as always, a new day brings new thoughts. And I've been thinking, briefly, on how to begin this experience anew for the session today. And understanding myself to be somebody that can be at times quite scatterbrained, difficulty focusing attention, I think it's necessary to say a few words today. I had a dream early this morning before I woke up. I believe my alarm was at 4:45, and the dream probably was an hour or two before that. Sometimes it's hard to say. But I woke up with the strong memory of it. My waking hours were the tail end of it. And it was a dream that was quite violent. It was a dream that involved, I think, what I was speaking about here. There was a profound uncertainty, I think, in my mind when I went to sleep about my understanding of belief. And I don't think that it was an accident that what occurred in my mind was a violent struggle. The exact context of the dream I don't think is all that important, but I know that of the elements that were in the dream, one was an excited heart such that I was not thinking reasonably. It led me to poor conclusions, and by those poor conclusions, violence, and extreme violence was the result of it. And I think that this dream was sort of a thought experiment about belief gone awry. And I spent time justifying belief as a term, trying to define it. I suppose we can say justify and define as two separate things, but all the same, that hunger for understanding what belief is, I think, led that dream to come about. And so what I'd like to get into, again, is another discussion about what belief is. And I know it might be redundant, but as this is an experience for myself, it's necessary in order to reach some satisfactory conclusion. Even if the day prior the road was paved and it felt smooth, it felt satisfactory, I woke up today realizing that it was not. And I don't think necessarily that the road that we went down yesterday was not good. I think that there was plenty of good in it. But for my mind, it did not stick the way that it ought to have. Another thing I want to bring up is belief as it relates to the divine, as it relates to God. Another theme that was in this dream was a strong sense of disbelief in God. And I woke up with a strange feeling, something that I had not felt since I was a late teen, early to mid-20s, sort of that atheistic anger types spread, we can say. And I say spread because it permeates your worldview, and it can make things dark. Now, the divine inspiration came back to me, but for a moment in the morning it felt odd. As my mind was waking up and the logical arguments that kept me at bay just were not coming to the surface. It wasn't until later in the day when they began to come and my anxieties declined. But nonetheless, it was a bizarre experience. And so there's another reason why I think we should explore, again, this matter of belief. So I'd like to start with, I think, one of the root causes for my irritation, I can also say confusion. It comes from the visitor. It comes from the particular way that he says this. He says, well, it has a big one. One sort of belief mimic is foolish and thinks he knows the things he only has beliefs about. It's the only has beliefs about that I struggle with. Much like I struggle with the concept of religion and the rooted sense of the word religio being disconnected in the mind of my friends in such a way that what I have come to understand and participate in this experience of building, the experience of coming to a greater love of life, that this intellectual exercise of recognizing the interconnectedness among things, to others, the term religion has nothing to do with that experience, and that rather it is more of a contrarian view, definition, almost as if the word itself has become corrupted and can no longer be used in any meaningful way. And I know, because I believe in my friends, I have faith in them, that they are not beyond the capacity, or reduced before the capacity, to have religious experiences. It's just in their mind they have lost the language for it. It is gone in their lexicon. And it makes me sad because I cannot participate with them in that way. I can do it indirectly, I suppose. And so I bring that up because there are all sorts of ways in which one can orient and view something. We can never see the whole of an object. Unfortunately, it can be kind of frustrating. I can pick up an object, so I have one in my hand here. This is a metal pawn from a chess set. And as much as I want, I can turn him in any way. I can look at him from straight up and straight from the bottom, and there's no way that I can see all of him at once. And I think what that means is, as a matter of perspective, when I look straight on at him, I can define all of his features, Somebody else can be looking at the back of him and define all of those features. Certainly many of them will overlap, but some of them will be necessarily different. And when it comes to disagreeing on the thing that we are looking at, it's extremely frustrating, because it's obvious that we're looking at the same thing, just from a different perspective. And in my mind, it's the religious obligation to connect the perspectives such that we can see truth more fully. So there's a few things that can get in the way of, or maybe not get in the way of, but there are a few things that are mentioned here that must be taken into consideration. One is that we're talking about belief mimic. Now, belief mimic is a particular relation. It's belief associated with a type of mimicry or copying. And we are also on the journey to find the Sophist, which is not an inherently uplifting journey, let's say. Not that it's a bad journey, but it's not a journey for which we are trying to find the absolute goodness in things. We are certainly after the truth, and so there's goodness in that. But what I mean to say is that if we were looking for the philosopher, let's say, our path would be different. But we have a contextual bent towards deception when we are thinking about finding the Sophist. And for my part, as I try to interpret my way through this, I'm not only trying to find the Sophist, but at the same time trying to find that goodness that fills me. And so again, keeping in mind belief mimic is part of the context. So, and he thinks he knows the things he only has beliefs about. So again, to define belief, we have a synonym which is trust. We have faith, to approve, to esteem. In modern language, belief is understood as a mental state or attitude in which a person accepts something as true or real, often without absolute proof. Now, I suppose that qualifier, often without absolute proof, is an issue. Because how would we define absolute proof? Now, within acceptance, the prudent person often has a procedure by which they accept something. There's a colloquial term, accepting something on faith, or trust. I understand where this is pointing. Again, it's pointing at without the absolute. We're stuck in the fog. But there's also an air of, at least in my mind, in the mind of uncertainty, there's an air of displeasure at the fog, that the conceited expectation, again, that comes from the poorer parts of myself, seem to suggest that we can do away with this fog. There's no reason why you have to be there. You have the mind to think clearly, so do that. And in a way that's true, but there's also a way in which that perspective cannot be completely true, absolutely true. Much like the matter of perspective. But just because of this, it doesn't give us the excuse not to have strong reason to accept something. Or if we say that we take something on faith, we believe it because there is a reason. We believe it because of what we receive, what we give, what it makes of us. And I accept that when we focus on belief, we can also focus on the negative aspects of the fog, which is the uncertainty, the obscured vision. But at the same time, I think in every breath that we do that, we also have to think that the human being is not a perfect creature, and although it is not an excuse to make clearer our vision, we have to understand that there always is going to be a degree of fog. It's a part of humility, I think, to accept that fact. But it is also not to say that the fog is the reason for our faith. It is just to recognize that the faith that we have may include some fog. It's our obligation to increase clarity. But as new questions arise, as new experiences take hold of us, the fog may return, and we'll have to go through a new experience of coming to understand, of coming to being in a better relationship with the divine, with God. So the visitor says earlier in this dialogue that believing is not anything else but thinking that something is so or is not so. So again, there's a lot dependent on what is being done in the process of thought. We can identify an individual that is prudent, that looks forward, such that what they expect out of their thought process on their way to belief is something that grounds them. It is something that gives them strength. I'm thinking about a house and the physical supports that go into that. And different types of construction, to be honest. I've been in a few apartment buildings for which, newly constructed apartment buildings in which the structure itself is very poor quality. They can be at one end of the building, and on the other end of the hallway, the window can shake when you're walking down the hallway. And in some buildings, you can have a very sturdy structure, such that there's very little sound, the foundations are firm, and depending on the individual, belief can go both ways. So an affirmation, something affirms something is true, or there's a denial, something is false. Or rather, I should say that there's the affirmation that something is, or the denial that something is. Now, we went through this before with our subject and predicate, our noun and our verb, our participation in being. There's a synthesis, a debate, a coming to some conclusion about whether or not the combination is actually true. Now, when we find ourselves in the mimicry domain, I have to wonder, I think that there is an inherent fogging, let's say. There's an inherent obstruction of mind that takes place. Mental resources go towards the producing of the image and the reflection of the image, rather than the analysis of the image, the integration of that information, integration in such a way that does not wish to take that which is and supplant their own identity for it, which is something that's impossible. And I say that it is impossible because if we are to identify that which is, we put ourselves next to it. No matter how much we wish to clothe ourselves in the likeness of another thing, we are still going to be separated from that thing. It is because of the very existence of that which is not that this occurs. That type of unification does not occur in man. That's not to say that transformation doesn't occur. Of course that happens. And we move closer in relation to certain things than others. There's a lot of dynamism, I think, that occurs in the relationality of man's experience. But one thing I could say that I believe because it seems to make sense, is that the influence of difference will not accept the sort of the black hole of identity. That everything is sucked up into, just by desire, into a singular form. So again, in the context of the Sophist, we are thinking about the Sophist taking a copy of something, believing in that copy in such a way that his beliefs become in a sense, become clouded in respect or in light of something else that has some particular orientation to which, to something that is, to some relationship that is, let's say. So I have a bit of an issue when he says only beliefs about. But I will give leeway, again, in respect that this only belief, in the context of the belief mimic, means and implies that there is an additional clouding of judgment that has taken place because of an inappropriate synthesis of, we can say, subject and predicate. That the desire is for this merging with the subject rather than participation with it. The visitor says, the other sort has been around a lot of discussions, and so by temperament he's suspicious and fearful that he doesn't know the things that he pretends in front of others to know. Now this is something that I find interesting because I can identify this in my own experience. Perhaps there's an element of me that is a bit of a sophist. I wouldn't wish to claim, and I do not claim, in honesty, that a large portion of myself is the sophist, but when I encounter people of superior knowledge, superior intellect, superior IQ, there's a number of things that happen. I begin to wonder about my own understanding of things. Some of it, I think, can be a lack of self-confidence, which might not necessarily mean that what is occurring is a realization of my ignorance, but rather I'm convincing myself that by somebody else's knowledge that mine is somehow invalidated by it, or because I am unable to articulate something in a particular way, then that means that, again, I am inferior in some way. But again, there's this sort of copy-making, kind of, that occurs, in a sense that what I am producing, what I'm trying to be, is the copy that, or I'm trying to mimic, perhaps, in my mind, what I'm seeing in this highly intelligent person, and that what goes out the window is actually my true understanding, and what I wish to be like is this person. And so I don't want to be like myself because I can't articulate in the way that this person can. And so I take on a mimicry role Or I shut down and I don't engage because of the self-doubt. But of course this ought not to be. If one believes that one has a true statement and there's a proper place for it, then it ought to be said. But perhaps by the height of somebody else's statement and the advancement of knowledge that they possess, what knowledge one does possess may not be sufficient for the conversation. That is also true. Or possible, I should say. There's nothing like the fear, the anxiety, to destroy the thoughtful mind, to completely and utterly incapacitate it, that even the most simple of things become difficult. So we understand there to be a sincere type of imitator, the one that knows why he imitates. It's hard to say. Earlier we discussed some of these possibilities, like in the case of the actor. Some purpose by which, within the fog of belief, the imitator wishes to cleanse that fog, to dissipate it, and to move us closer to a stronger sense of awareness or understanding. The visitor says, or he asks Theaetetus, are there one or two kinds of insincere ones? And he comes to the conclusion that there are two. He says, I see that one sort can maintain his sincerity in long speeches to a crowd, and the other uses short speeches in private conversation to force the person talking with him to contradict himself. Now this is a bit different from where we have just been in thinking about the belief mimic in a way that he's taking on the identity of somebody else. Here there seems to be a bit more of an intricate relationship, especially that of the latter. The one who uses the short speeches in private to force the person talking with him to contradict himself. The first question that I ask is why? And I think the answer is to make the individual believe that by that contradiction they know nothing, and also as a separate consequences that the sophist is the one that knows the truth of the matter, since they have exposed the falsehood in their belief. The visitor says, how shall we show up the long-winded sort? As a statesman or a demagogue? Theaetetus as a demagogue. And what shall we call the other one? Wise or a sophist? We can't call him wise, since we took him not to know anything. But since he imitates the wise man, he'll obviously have a name derived from the wise man's name. And now at last I see that we have to call him the person who is really and truly a sophist. So let's think about this for a moment. Thinking about the long-winded sort. Again, an insincere one. Somebody that is sincere is honest. That they are interested, they are attentive in what is good. The insincere have alternative motives. From the etymological perspective, sincere is associated with something that is pure, that is clean, unadulterated, sound, genuine. And we think of the insincere as something that is unclean, dirty, full of sin. And so keeping in mind that we are thinking about one that is dirty but long-winded, and then one that is dirty but gives short speeches, it's hard to say that there is much difference here other than the length of their dialogue. Now, a demagogue, the long-winded sort, now given that the statesman is the dialogue that we're going to be getting into next, I'm quite interested in seeing where this goes. Now, the word demagogue, from the mid-17th century, we received this word from the French, which is from the Greek. And what we have is the compound, demos, meaning people, the populace, the common citizens, and agagos, leader, guide, from the verb ago, to lead, bring, conduct. So we have the meaning, leader of the people. In classical Greek, this term could be neutral or even positive, referring to a political leader who represented common people. By the 5th and 4th century BCE in Athens, in the writings of Thucydides, Aristotle, and others, it took on a negative connotation. A popular leader who gained influence by appealing to emotions, prejudice, and flattery rather than reasoned policy. And of course, in the English, we have inherited that negative sense. And it would seem that in this situation, we're also talking about a negative context. If the demagogue is to be referred to as this insincere, long-winded belief imitator, someone who crafts persuasive appearances of truth for large audiences. The visitor says, "Shall we weave his name together from start to finish, and tie it up the way we did before?" He says, imitation of the contrary speech-producing, insincere, and unknowing sort of the appearance-making kind of copy-making. The word-juggling part of production that's marked off as human and not divine. Anyone who says the Sophist is of this blood and family will be saying, it seems, the complete truth. Theaetetus says, absolutely. And it's at this point that we finished the dialogue, the Sophist, to be continued next time in the dialogue, the Statesman. So this is where I will finish our series here. Until next time.